The moment Boone Cutter's filthy hand reached across the polished mahogany bar toward the crystal decanter, Mei Lin Zhao knew this night would end in blood or brilliance. Four armed outlaws surrounded her in the empty saloon, their laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed 100 threats before, but none while she stood alone. Her husband's pistol lay 3 steps away, useless against these odds. The town that had taken her money for 2 years wouldn't lift a finger to save her now. So she did what survivors do. She smiled, reached for the one bottle that could save her life, and said, "Gentlemen, this round's on me. If you're watching from halfway across the world or just down the road, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Mei Lin's story travels. And if you're wondering whether a widow with nothing but her wits can outplay 4 killers, well, hit that like button and let's find out together." The summer of 1872 arrived in Redemption Gulch like a creditor demanding payment, hot, merciless, and impossible to ignore. The Montana Territory sun beat down on the dusty main street with the kind of heat that made men mean and dogs seek shade beneath rotting boardwalks. In the Golden Phoenix Saloon, the air hung thick with the smell of sawdust, whiskey, and the ghost of opium smoke that no amount of scrubbing could erase from the walls. Mei Lin Zhao moved behind the bar with the efficiency of someone who had learned that wasted motion meant wasted money. At 25, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stare. High cheekbones, dark eyes that revealed nothing, and black hair she wore in a severe bun that suggested she had no time for vanity. The red silk dress she wore had been her husband's favorite, now faded to the color of old blood at the seams. She'd mended it so many times the original stitching had become a memory. "Another," grunted Pete Holloway, sliding his glass across the bar with the practiced gesture of a man who'd been drinking since noon. Mei Lin poured exactly 2 fingers of rot-gut whiskey, the cheap stuff she kept for men who couldn't tell the difference, and collected his nickel without meeting his eyes. In 2 years of running this establishment, she'd learned that eye contact invited conversation, and conversation led to questions she had no interest in answering. The afternoon crowd was thin. Besides Pete, only 3 other souls occupied the Phoenix. Old Silas McKenna, who played solitaire in the corner with cards so worn the suits had become suggestions. Mary Catherine Wells, who ran the dress shop and occasionally permitted herself a small sherry while her husband thought she was ordering fabric. And Ethan Cole, the quiet rancher who always sat at the table nearest the window, nursing the same beer for 2 hours while reading newspapers that were 3 weeks old by the time they reached Montana. Ethan was different from the others. He always paid, he never leered, and he had the peculiar habit of actually saying thank you when she served him, as if her labor had value beyond the transaction. Outside, the street baked empty. Most sensible people had retreated indoors or found excuses to travel to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. Redemption. Gulch wasn't much. Maybe 200 souls if you counted the Chinese workers in the mining camp 3 miles north and the scattered homesteaders scratching livings from reluctant soil. The silver strike that had birthed the town 8 years ago had played out, leaving behind just enough economic activity to keep the place from becoming a ghost town, but not enough to attract the kind of civilization that came with churches and schools and laws that mattered. The Golden Phoenix stood on the corner of what optimistic civic planners had named Prosperity Street and what everyone actually called Mud Alley. 3 stories of weathered timber that leaned slightly to the left, as if perpetually drunk. The ground floor housed the saloon. The second floor had been divided into small rooms her late husband had rented to the kind of women who worked by the hour. Mei Lin had ended that business the day after his funeral, though the town still looked at her establishment and saw sin. The third floor was hers alone, a private world of carefully maintained furniture, books written in Chinese that no one else in Redemption Gulch could read, and a window that faced east toward mountains that reminded her, in certain light, of the peaks she'd last seen at 15 when her father sold her passage to America with promises of opportunity. Those promises, like most promises, had proven negotiable. "Rider coming," Silas announced without looking up from his cards. The old man had spent his youth as a cavalry scout, and some instincts never died. 4 of them, actually, coming fast. Mei Lin's hand stilled on the glass she was polishing. Riders who came fast rarely brought good news. She glanced toward Ethan, whose posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. His right hand had moved from the newspaper to rest casually on his thigh, inches from the Colt revolver he wore low and businesslike. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside. Boots hit dirt. Spurs jangled. The saloon's door crashed open hard enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar. 4 men entered like a weather front, sudden, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The leader stood well over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, in a way that suggested violence was his primary occupation. His face looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who'd given up on the finer details. Flat nose, heavy brow, and a jaw that jutted forward with the confidence of a man who'd never met meaningful resistance. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling his expression into a permanent sneer. He wore a cluster of pistols that would have looked absurd on anyone less threatening. "Well, well," he rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. "Look what we got here, boys. A genuine Oriental pleasure palace." His companions spread out with the practiced spacing of men who'd kicked indoors together before. One was thin as a knife blade, with nervous eyes that never stopped moving. Another had the soft, pale look of someone who'd spent too much time indoors, though the matched pistols on his belt suggested his indoor activities didn't involve reading. The fourth was younger, maybe 19, with the kind of pretty features that would have looked better on a girl and the desperate expression of someone trying to prove he belonged. Maylin set down her polishing cloth with deliberate care. She'd seen their type before, men who took what they wanted and called it freedom. The trick was showing neither fear nor defiance, just the blank professionalism of commerce. "Gentlemen," she said, her English still carrying the accent she'd never quite shed, "what can I get you?" The big man, Boone Cutter, though she wouldn't learn his name until later, walked to the bar and leaned against it with the casual entitlement of ownership. "We'll start with your best whiskey, 4 glasses, and keep them coming." Maylin reached for the good bottle, the amber liquid that actually came from Kentucky instead of some poisoners still in the back country. She poured 4 measured shots and set them on the bar. "That'll be $2. Boone laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "That'll be free. On account of we're celebrating." "I don't give credit," Maylin said. "And I don't give charity. $2. The nervous one, Skitch, the others called him, giggled like something was deeply funny. The soft-looking one with the matched pistols moved to block the door. The young one just watched, his hand hovering near his gun like he was rehearsing the draw in his mind. "You hear that, boys?" Boone said, his eyes never leaving Maylin. "The China girl thinks we're paying customers. That's precious. That's real precious." Pete Holloway suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere, sliding off his stool and making for the door with the careful steps of a man trying not to be noticed. The soft one let him pass. Mary Catherine had gone pale, her sherry forgotten. Silas kept playing cards, but his hands had started to tremble. Only Ethan remained perfectly still, though Maylin noticed his newspaper had been set aside. "House rules are simple," Maylin said, her voice level. "You drink, you pay. You don't pay, you don't drink. You want a drink for free? There's a creek outside with all the water you can swallow." Boone's smile widened, showing teeth that would have benefited from a dentist's attention a decade ago. "House rules," he repeated, savoring the words. "Boys, she's talking about house rules, like this is her house, like she's got some kind of say in the matter." He reached across the bar with shocking speed, his massive hand closing around Maylin's wrist. His grip was iron, calculated to hurt without breaking, the grip of a man who'd intimidated countless women and knew exactly how much pressure would make them fold. "Let me explain how this works," he said, pulling her forward until she was pressed against the bar, his breath hot and sour with tobacco and rotting teeth. "You're going to pour, we're going to drink, and you're going to smile real pretty while you do it. And if you're real sweet about the whole thing, maybe we leave your establishment here in one piece. Maybe we even leave you in one piece. You understanding me, China girl?" The saloon had gone silent except for the buzz of flies against the window and the sound of Boone's breathing. Maylin could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting to see if she would break. She'd felt this moment before. The moment when the world offered you a choice between dignity and survival, and made it clear you probably couldn't have both. She'd felt it on the ship from San Francisco when the first mate had cornered her below deck. She'd felt it in her husband's opium haze when debts came due, and he'd suggested there were ways a pretty wife could help. She'd felt it at his funeral when the banker had explained that a woman couldn't own property in Montana Territory, and perhaps she should consider certain arrangements if she wanted to keep her late husband's business. Each time she'd found a third option. "I understand," she said quietly. Boone's grip loosened slightly, satisfaction spreading across his scarred face. "That's better. That's real." Maylene twisted her wrist in the specific way her father had taught her before selling her away, a technique from some village kung fu that he'd learned from his uncle. The grip that had seemed unbreakable suddenly had a weakness. She pulled free and stepped back, her hand stinging but her pride intact. Then she slapped him. The sound cracked through the saloon like a gunshot. Boone's head snapped sideways from the force of it, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Mary Catherine gasped. Silas's cards scattered across the table. Even Skitch stopped giggling. Ethan Cole stood up. Boone touched his face where her palm had connected, his fingers coming away as if checking for blood. When he looked at Maylin again, all pretense of civility had vanished from his expression. What remained was pure, murderous rage. "You stupid yellow bitch," he said, his voice dropping to something worse than shouting. "You just bought yourself a world of hurt." He reached for her again, and this time his intent was clear. Not intimidation, but violence. Behind him, his companions moved forward, their hands going to their weapons. Maylin's mind worked with the cold clarity that came from knowing she had seconds to either save herself or die. The pistol her husband had kept beneath the bar was loaded but 3 steps away, and might as well have been in China for all the good it would do her. She could scream, but the nearest law was Sheriff McCready, who was probably drunk in his office and wouldn't care about a Chinese woman's problems anyway. She could run, but Boone stood between her and both exits, and running would only delay the inevitable. So she did the only thing left. She reached for the bottle. Not the good Kentucky whiskey they'd been demanding, not the rotgut she served the daily drunks, but the special bottle, the one in the green glass that sat on the highest shelf behind the bar, the one her husband had made in his final lucid month before opium stole his mind completely. Chen Zhao had been many things: a dreamer, a fool, an addict, a man who'd let his wife down in every way that mattered. But before the pipe had claimed him, he'd been something else, a chemist of sorts, trained in traditional medicine before poverty and desperation brought him to America. He'd made this bottle for their first anniversary, a blend of herbs and flowers and things she didn't have names for in English, meant to bring peaceful sleep and pleasant dreams. He'd also mentioned, in that careful way of his, that too much would bring not sleep but unconsciousness, that a man who drank a full glass might not wake for 12 hours, that the line between medicine and poison was mostly a matter of dosage and intent. The bottle had sat untouched for 2 years, waiting. Maylin took it down with steady hands. The glass was cool and heavy, and the liquid inside was the deep amber of expensive bourbon, though bourbon it definitely was not. "You want your whiskey," she said, her voice carrying through the silent saloon. "I'll give you your whiskey. The best in the house. Drink up, gentlemen. This round's on me." She pulled the cork and poured 4 generous shots, far more generous than the careful 2 fingers she'd pour for paying customers. The liquid had a sweet, floral smell that spoke of meadows and spring rains, nothing like the harsh burn of real whiskey. Boone stared at the glasses, then at her, suspicion fighting with wounded pride. His companions waited for his lead, hands still on their weapons. "What kind of game you playing?" Boone demanded. "No game," Maylin said. "You wanted to drink. Now drink." Or was all that talk just wind? The challenge was calculated, precise. Men like Boone lived and died by their pride, by the appearance of strength. To refuse now would be to admit doubt, maybe even fear. His companions were watching. The whole saloon was watching. Boone's jaw worked as he considered his options. Then, moving with the deliberate aggression of a man determined to prove a point, he grabbed the nearest glass and drained it in one swallow. His companions followed suit. The nervous Skitch, the soft-faced gunman, and the pretty young one who was still trying so hard to look tough. Maylin watched them drink her husband's final gift, and she allowed herself the smallest smile. "Another round?" she asked. "Damn right, another round," Boone growled, slamming his glass down. "And it better be the real stuff this time, not whatever flowery horseshit you just served." But his words were already starting to slur at the edges. She poured again, and again they drank. The conversation among them grew louder, their movements broader and less coordinated. Skitch started giggling again, but this time there was a dreamy quality to it. The soft-faced one sat down heavily, one sat down heavily in a chair that protested his weight. The young one blinked repeatedly, as if trying to clear his vision. Boone lasted longest, his constitution built by years of abuse. But even he couldn't fight chemistry. His eyes went glassy. His massive frame swayed. "You," he said, pointing at Mei Lin with a finger that seemed to have trouble finding her. "You. What did you—" Then his knees buckled, and he crashed to the floor like a felled tree. His companions followed within seconds, collapsing into graceless heaps on the sawdust. The silence that followed was absolute. Mei Lin stepped around the bar, her red silk dress whispering against her legs. She looked down at the 4 unconscious men who had come to rob her, assault her, perhaps kill her. Their chests rose and fell with the deep, slow breathing of drugged sleep. "They'll wake in 12 hours, she said to the room at large. "Maybe less, maybe more. They won't remember much. And when they do wake up, they're the sheriff's problem, not mine." She turned to face the remaining patrons. Mary Catherine was staring at her with something between horror and awe. Silas had a grin on his weathered face that made him look 40 years younger, and Ethan Cole was walking toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gray eyes studying her face. "That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen a woman do," he said, finally. "Brave and crazy often look the same," Mei Lin replied. "You need help getting them to the jail?" She looked at him properly for the first time in 2 years, really looked, not just the quick glances of commerce. He was maybe 30, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. Tall, but not imposing, built lean and strong in the way of men who worked cattle rather than sitting behind desks. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, but clean, and he held himself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with swagger. "I'd appreciate that," she said. Ethan turned to Silas. "You sober enough to help me drag?" "Sober enough to drag," Silas confirmed, abandoning his cards with obvious relief. Together, the 2 men began the awkward process of moving unconscious outlaws. They started with Boone, each taking an arm and dragging him toward the door, with his boots leaving twin trails in the sawdust. Mary Catherine hurried to open the door for them, then followed them out, no doubt rushing to spread the news through town, which left Mei Lin alone in her saloon with 3 still unconscious men and the reality of what she'd just done. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had kept her steady beginning to leak away. She gripped the edge of the bar and allowed herself 10 seconds of trembling, 10 seconds of being the terrified woman she hadn't let herself be while Boone Cutter's hand had closed around her wrist. Then she straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and began cleaning up the mess. She was sweeping broken glass. One of the shots had fallen when Skitch collapsed. When Ethan returned. "Sheriff's got 2 of them locked up," he reported. "Me and Silas are going back for the other 2. McCready was drunk, like usual, but even he could see this situation was serious. Asked how they ended up unconscious. "And what did you tell him?" "Told him they drank too much cheap whiskey on empty stomachs and passed out, which is true enough from a certain point of view." Mei Lin met his eyes. "And why would you lie for me?" Ethan considered the question. "Didn't figure it was lying, figured it was justice. Those men came in here planning violence. You handled it without anyone getting hurt. Seemed like the story that leads to the most peace is the one where stupid outlaws drank themselves unconscious and got what was coming to them. The sheriff believed you. Sheriff believes what's convenient to believe. And convenient right now is that he's got 4 wanted men in his jail, and he didn't have to risk his neck to put them there." Ethan paused. "That one they call Boone Cutter? There's paper on him in 3 territories. Robbery, assault, 1 suspected murder. The others 2, those smaller bounties. When word gets out they're here, there'll be U.S. Marshals coming through. Might even be some reward money." Mei Lin hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been focused on survival, not profit. "I don't want their money." "Might not have a choice. The law likes everything neat and tied up. They'll want to know how the capture happened. Right now, the story is that they picked the wrong saloon to drink in, and you served them into unconsciousness. That's a story that makes you smart and them stupid. A story with drugged whiskey makes things complicated, makes lawyers get involved, Makes you have to explain things to judges who might not be inclined to see a Chinese woman's side of events. He was right, and she knew it. The law in Montana Territory was flexible when applied to white men with property and connections, but rigid as iron when dealing with anyone else. The difference between self-defense and poisoning was often a matter of who told the story and how sympathetic the jury felt. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding. Thank you for making sure I didn't have to draw on 4 armed men this afternoon," Ethan replied. "I'm fair with a pistol, but those odds weren't in my favor." They looked at each other for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Ethan touched his hat brim and headed back outside to help Silas with the remaining unconscious outlaws. Mei Lin continued cleaning. She swept the sawdust, washed the glasses, and put the special bottle back on its high shelf. When the floor was pristine and the bar gleamed in the late afternoon light streaming through the windows, she allowed herself to sit down on the customer's side for the first time in 2 years. The Golden Phoenix was quiet. Empty. Hers. Outside, she could hear the town coming alive with news. Doors slamming, voices raised in excitement. The word spreading that something had actually happened in Redemption Gulch, something worth talking about over dinner and drinks and in tomorrow's rumors. By the time Ethan and Silas finished delivering the unconscious men to Sheriff McCready's jail, a crowd had gathered. Merchants left their shops. The few women in town congregated outside the milliners, whispering behind gloved hands. Even some of the Chinese miners from the camp had wandered down, drawn by news that traveled fast in a town this small. Mei Lin watched through her window as Ethan fielded questions, spinning the story just as he'd said he would. Drunk outlaws, bad whiskey, their own stupidity. Some people believed it immediately. Others looked skeptical but didn't push back. And a few looked toward the Golden Phoenix with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not judgment, not the careful distance they'd maintained for 2 years. Respect. Night came to Redemption Gulch the way it always did, fast and complete, the sun dropping behind the mountains like a coin down a well. Mei Lin lit the lamps in the saloon out of habit, though she had no expectation of customers. After the afternoon's excitement, she figured people would give her place a wide berth for a few days at least. She was wrong. The first person through the door was Mary Catherine, still pale, but determined. She ordered a sherry and actually paid for it with a silver dollar, telling Mei Lin to keep the change. "That was the bravest thing I ever saw," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way you stood up to them. The way you didn't break." Before Mei Lin could respond, the door opened again, and again, and again. They came in ones and twos at first, then in small groups. The merchants who'd been too afraid to defend her, the miners who'd watched from the doorway, even a few of the homesteaders who rarely came to town at all. They ordered drinks and paid without complaint. They spoke to her with courtesy rather than contempt. They occupied her tables and filled her saloon with the sound of voices and the clink of glasses. And they stayed. By 9 o'clock, the Golden Phoenix was more crowded than it had been in 6 months. By 10, Mei Lin was running low on good whiskey and had to tap into her reserve stock. By 11, she was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, her feet aching and her coin box heavy. Ethan Cole sat at his usual table, nursing the same beer and reading the same old newspapers. But every so often, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Around midnight, the crowd began to thin. The merchants went home to their wives. The miners headed back to their camp. The homesteaders mounted horses and rode into darkness toward distant cabins. By 1 in the morning, only Ethan remained. Mei Lin locked the door and turned the sign to closed. She began the familiar ritual of end-of-day cleaning, washing glasses, wiping tables, sweeping the floor that had been tracked with dirt from 24 pairs of boots. Ethan helped without asking, carrying chairs, emptying ashtrays, making himself useful in the easy way of someone who understood physical work. "You don't have to do that," Mei Lin said. "Seems fair," Ethan replied. "You served half the town tonight. Least someone could do is help clean up after them." They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes. Then Ethan spoke again. "What you did today," he said carefully. "That took more than just courage. That took planning, took knowing your options and choosing the smartest one." "I didn't have many options." Most people faced with four armed men would have folded, would have given them what they wanted and hoped they'd leave without doing worse damage. You didn't. Folding never works, Maylin said, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the bar. Men like that, you give them an inch and they take everything. I learned that the hard way. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Your husband, he said finally. Chen. I never knew him well, but I bought supplies from him a few times before he got sick. He seemed like a decent man. He was a decent man who made indecent choices, Maylin replied. But he's gone, and I'm still here, so I make different choices. Good choices, Ethan said. Smart choices. She looked at him then, really looked. Why do you come here? To the Phoenix. You could drink anywhere. The Silver Dollar has better whiskey. The Red Ace has poker games. But you come here 3-4 times a week and sit at that same table reading newspapers you've probably already read. Why? Ethan met her gaze. Honest answer? Honest answer. Because you remind me that surviving isn't the same as living, he said. I watch you keep this place running against odds that would break most men. I watch you maintain your dignity in a town that doesn't want to give you any. I watch you work twice as hard for half the respect. And it reminds me that I don't get to complain about my bad years or my hard luck, because at least I'm free to make my own way without half the territory thinking I don't belong here. Maylin felt something shift in her chest, a wall she hadn't known she'd built suddenly developing a crack. I'm not some symbol of perseverance, she said quietly. I'm just trying not to starve. Maybe, Ethan said, but the way you don't starve matters. The way you didn't let those men break you today, that mattered to more people than you know. I saw it in their faces tonight. They were here because you showed them something they needed to see. And what was that? That scared people can still be brave. That being alone doesn't mean being helpless. That sometimes the smart move beats the strong move. He paused. That a woman in a red silk dress can outthink 4 armed men and walk away with her head high. Maylin felt tears threaten. Rare, dangerous tears she couldn't afford to shed. She turned away, busying herself with arranging bottles that didn't need arranging. It's late, she said. You should go home. I should, Ethan agreed, but he didn't move. They stood in the dim saloon, separated by the length of the bar and the width of everything unspoken between them. Outside, Redemption Gulch slept its restless sleep, dreaming whatever dreams such towns dreamed. Finally, Ethan picked up his hat from the table. I'll come by tomorrow, he said. Make sure you didn't have any trouble during the night. Those 4 had friends, and friends sometimes get ideas about revenge. I can take care of myself. I know you can, Ethan said, but that doesn't mean you should have to. He let himself out into the night, the door closing softly behind him. Maylin stood alone in her saloon, listening to the building settle around her, and thought about the strange events of the day. She thought about Boone Cutter's hand on her wrist, about the weight of the green bottle in her hand, about the moment of choice between breaking and bending. She thought about Ethan Cole's gray eyes, and the way he helped without being asked. She thought about a saloon full of people who had finally decided she was worth defending, even if that defense came 12 hours too late. And she thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days stretching ahead like an unmapped territory she would have to cross alone. Except maybe, not entirely alone. Upstairs in her private rooms, Maylin changed out of her red silk dress and into the simple cotton nightgown she'd brought from San Francisco. She brushed out her hair, counting the strokes the way her mother had taught her before dying of fever when Maylin was 12. She washed her face in cold water from the basin and looked at herself in the cracked mirror. The woman looking back was older than 25. Harder, more tired, but still standing, still here. She climbed into bed and blew out the lamp, letting darkness fill the room. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the Montana sky. The same stars that hung over China, over San Francisco, over every place she'd been and every place she'd lost. Tomorrow, Sheriff McCready would want statements. The marshal would eventually arrive with questions. The town would continue to buzz with gossip and speculation. But tonight, right now, she was safe in her own place, in her own bed, and 4 men who'd tried to break her were sleeping off drugged whiskey in a jail cell. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't justice, it was just survival. But Maylin was learning that sometimes survival was enough. Maylin woke to the sound of breaking glass. Her eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, her body already moving before her mind fully processed the danger. She rolled out of bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and reached for the small knife she kept beneath her pillow. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Another crash, this one closer. Downstairs in the saloon, she pulled on her robe and crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knife felt inadequate in her hand, its 4-inch blade useless against whoever was destroying her establishment. Through the floorboards came the sound of furniture being overturned, bottles smashing, voices raised in anger. "Burn it!" someone snarled. "Burn the whole damn place down!" Maylin's blood went cold. Fire was every building owner's nightmare, especially in a town where structures stood shoulder to shoulder and water came from wells that ran dry by August. A fire in the Golden Phoenix wouldn't stop at her walls. It would consume half of Redemption Gulch before anyone could organize a bucket line. She had maybe minutes to stop this. Moving with the silence her father had drilled into her during childhood games that weren't really games, Maylin descended the back stairs that led to the storage room behind the bar. The sounds of destruction grew louder, men laughing, cursing, their boots crunching on broken glass. Through a crack in the door, she could see shadows moving in the lamplight they'd brought with them. 3 men. Not the 4 from yesterday. These were different, though cut from the same cloth. One held a whiskey bottle with a rag stuffed in the neck, clearly preparing a makeshift torch. Another was systematically smashing every bottle behind the bar, creating a lake of alcohol that would ignite like gunpowder. The third stood watch at the door, a rifle cradled in his arms. "Boone's gonna appreciate this," the one with the bottle said. "Nobody drugs our boys and gets away clean. This China bitch needs to learn her place." Maylin's mind raced through options, each worse than the last. She could run out the back, save herself, and let them burn her life's work. She could try to fight 3 armed men with a kitchen knife and likely get shot for her trouble. She could scream for help that wouldn't arrive in time, or she could be smarter than they were. Her eyes fell on the storage room's contents: barrels of beer, crates of whiskey, cleaning supplies, and the old hunting rifle Chen had kept for protection but never learned to shoot properly. It was loaded, she knew, because she'd loaded it herself after his death and never unloaded it. But firing a gun she barely knew how to use at 3 men in the dark seemed like an excellent way to get killed. Then she saw the ammonia. She'd bought it 3 months ago for cleaning, a concentrated solution the hardware store owner had warned her to dilute heavily and never, ever mix with other chemicals. The bottle sat on a high shelf, skull and crossbones painted on the label. Maylin grabbed it along with the vinegar she used for the windows. She took one of Chen's old shirts from the rag pile and soaked it in water from the cleaning bucket. Then, wrapping the wet cloth around her nose and mouth, she opened both bottles and hurled them through the doorway into the saloon. The glass shattered across the floor, mixing with the puddle of spilled alcohol. Within seconds, acrid fumes began rising, not enough to kill, but more than enough to choke, to blind, to send unprepared men stumbling for fresh air. "What the hell?" one of the intruders managed before his voice dissolved into coughing. "Get out! Get out!" another shouted, his words barely intelligible through the hacking. Maylin heard boots scrambling for the door, men cursing and gagging as they fled the poisonous cloud she'd created. She gave them 30 seconds, counting in her head the way her mother had taught her to count through pain, through fear, through anything that required endurance. Then she ran through the fumes herself, her wet cloth barely protecting her burning eyes and throat, grabbed the hunting rifle from the storage room, and burst out the front door into the street. The 3 men were on their hands and knees in the dirt, coughing up what sounded like pieces of their lungs. The one who'd been making the torch had dropped it, and the flame had guttered out in the dust. The rifleman's weapon lay several feet away, abandoned in his desperate flight from the chemical fog. Maylin leveled her rifle at them, trying to remember everything Chen had told her about shooting, butt against the shoulder, finger outside the trigger guard until ready. Breathe. "Don't move," she said, her voice rough from the fumes. "Any of you move, I shoot." One of them, a lean man with a face like a weasel, looked up at her with streaming eyes. "You wouldn't dare, you yellow—" She fired. The bullet kicked up dirt 6 inches from his hand, the report echoing off the buildings like thunder. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she worked the bolt action the way Chen had shown her, chambering another round. "Next one's in your leg," she said. "After that, I work my way up." They believed her. She could see it at their faces. The sudden realization that the woman they'd come to terrorize was entirely capable of shooting them where they knelt. The weasel-faced one raised his hands slowly. His companions followed suit. By now, lights were coming on in buildings up and down the street. Doors opened. Voices called out in confusion and alarm, and running footsteps approached from the direction of the sheriff's office. Ethan Cole arrived first, his pistol drawn, taking in the scene with a quick sweep of his eyes. Behind him came Sheriff McCready, moving faster than Mei Lin had thought possible for a man who spent most of his time drunk. "What in the name of—" McCready began. "They tried to burn down my saloon," Mei Lin said flatly, the rifle never wavering from its targets. "Broke in before dawn, I stopped them." "She's lying," the weasel-faced man protested. "We were just walking by and she came out shooting. With a whiskey bottle stuffed with a rag for a torch?" Ethan interrupted, nudging the abandoned improvised weapon with his boot. "That's a hell of a thing to be carrying on a morning walk." More townspeople were gathering now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Mei Lin recognized merchants, miners, even Mary Catherine in her nightdress with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. They stared at her standing there in her robe with a hunting rifle, at the three would-be arsonists on their knees, at the chemical fog still seeping from her open door. "Sheriff," one of the kneeling men said, "we got rights. We demand—" "You demand nothing," McCready said, surprising Mei Lin with the steel in his voice. "You broke into a legitimate business with intent to commit arson. That's attempted murder in my book, seeing as how fire in this town doesn't respect property lines." He gestured to Ethan. "Help me get these fools to the cells before I let Mrs. Zhao shoot them proper." Ethan holstered his pistol and pulled the weasel-faced man to his feet none too gently. "You heard the sheriff. On your feet, all of you." As McCready and Ethan marched the prisoners toward the jail, the crowd began to murmur. Mei Lin became acutely aware that she was standing in the middle of the street in her nightclothes, holding a rifle, having just shot at 3 men in front of half the town. She lowered the weapon and turned to face her saloon. The chemical fog was dissipating now, revealing the destruction inside. Broken bottles, overturned tables, shattered glass covering every surface. It would take days to clean, weeks to replace the lost inventory, and the smell would linger for months. But it hadn't burned. That was something. "Ma'am?" A voice at her elbow made her turn. It was Tom Fletcher, who ran the hardware store. "You used ammonia in there, didn't you? Mixed it with something acidic?" "Vinegar," Mei Lin confirmed. Fletcher let out a low whistle. "That's dangerous chemistry. Could have killed yourself breathing those fumes." "Better than burning alive," she replied. He nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true. I suppose that's very true." He paused, then added, "I'll come by later with materials to help patch up the damage. No charge. Figure it's the least the town can do." "I can pay—" "I know you can," Fletcher said. "But you shouldn't have to. Not after this." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Mei Lin standing in the street wondering what had just shifted in the social calculus of Redemption Gulch. Mary Catherine approached next, her face pale but determined. "I'll help clean," she announced. "My husband can spare me for the day, and I'll bring the other ladies. We'll have this place set to rights by nightfall." "You don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Mary Catherine said firmly. "We all do. You've been running this establishment for 2 years, and in all that time, how many of us have lifted a finger to help you? How many times have we looked the other way when men disrespected you, when they paid you short, when they said things no woman should have to hear?" She shook her head. "No more. What happened yesterday, what happened this morning, that ends now. You're part of this town whether the town likes it or not, and it's past time we started acting like it." Mei Lin felt that dangerous pressure behind her eyes again, tears threatening to spill. She'd lived 2 years without kindness, had built walls so thick she'd forgotten what it felt like when someone tried to breach them. "Thank you," she whispered. By the time the sun rose properly over the mountains, a dozen women had assembled outside the Golden Phoenix, armed with brooms and buckets and determination. They swept up broken glass, mopped the floors, salvaged what bottles could be saved, and created an inventory of what needed replacing. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd organized church socials and town celebrations, turning chaos into order with remarkable speed. The men came too, offering labor and materials, Tom Fletcher brought lumber to repair the damaged doorframe. Silas McKenna, soberer than Mei Lin had ever seen him, fixed the broken chairs with the skill of someone who'd done carpentry before age, and whiskey had bent his back. Even some of the Chinese miners from the camp appeared, speaking to Mei Lin in Cantonese and offering help with the heavy lifting that the women couldn't manage. Ethan returned around mid-morning, his face grim. "Sheriff's got all 7 of them locked up now," he reported. "The 4 from yesterday and these 3 from this morning. Turns out they're part of a bigger gang that's been working this territory for the better part of a year. The marshal's office has been looking for them." "They'll come for trial?" Mei Lin asked. Eventually, McCready sent a telegram to Helena. "Should hear back within the week." Ethan paused, studying her face. "You all right? Last night you fought off 4 men with chemistry. This morning you nearly shot 3 more. That's a lot for one person to carry." "I'm still standing," Mei Lin said. "That's what matters." "Standing isn't the same as all right." She looked at him, really looked, past the polite concern and into the genuine worry in his gray eyes. "No," she admitted. "It's not, but I don't have time to be not all right. I have a business to run." "Let others run it for today," Ethan said gently. "You've got half the town in here cleaning. Take a few hours, rest, process what happened. You've earned it." But resting meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Boone Cutter's hand on her wrist, meant hearing the crash of bottles breaking, meant seeing that torch about to set her whole life aflame. So Mei Lin kept working, kept moving, kept her hands busy, and her mind occupied with immediate tasks that had solutions. By late afternoon, the Golden Phoenix looked almost normal. The broken glass was gone, the furniture righted, the smell of chemicals masked by the sharp scent of lye soap and the sweet smell of fresh sawdust. The bottles behind the bar were sparser than before, but organized. The floor gleamed, the windows shone. Mary Catherine surveyed their work with satisfaction. "There," she declared. "Good as new. Better, even." "I don't know how to thank you all," Mei Lin said to the assembled women. "You don't need to thank us," replied Sarah Mitchell, the minister's wife, who'd spent 3 hours scrubbing floors despite her advanced pregnancy. "We should have done this 2 years ago. Should have welcomed you proper when your husband passed instead of leaving you to manage alone." "We were afraid," Mary Catherine admitted quietly. "Afraid of what people would say if we associated with a Chinese woman running a saloon," Mei Lin finished for her. "Yes," Mary Catherine said, meeting her eyes. "And we were cowards for it. But watching you stand up to those men yesterday, watching you defend your property this morning, it showed us something we needed to see. That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." The women filed out as evening approached, leaving Mei Lin alone in her restored saloon. She stood behind the bar, running her hand over the smooth mahogany, and tried to process the strange fact that in the space of 24 hours, her entire relationship with Redemption Gulch had transformed. She was still the Chinese widow running a saloon, still the outsider, still the woman who didn't quite fit into the narrow definitions the frontier allowed. But now she was also the woman who'd outthought 4 armed men, the woman who'd stopped an arson with chemistry. The woman who'd stood her ground when breaking would have been easier. That meant something, to them, and surprisingly, to her. The door opened and Ethan entered, carrying a wooden crate. "Brought you something," he said, setting it on the bar. Inside were a dozen bottles of decent whiskey, not the rotgut she usually served, but actual Kentucky bourbon with proper labels. "I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Ethan said firmly. "Consider it a loan against future business. I figure after word spreads about what happened here, you're going to have more customers than you know what to do with. People like a good story, and you've given them 2 in as many days." He was right. Even as they spoke, people were starting to drift in. Not for trouble this time, but for drinks and the chance to hear firsthand about the attempted arson. They came in 2s and 3s, ordered carefully, paid promptly, and treated her with a deference she'd never experienced before. By 8 o'clock, the saloon was full. By 9, she was turning people away at the door. And by 10, her cash box was heavier than it had been in months. Ethan stayed through the evening rush, helping serve drinks when the crowd got too thick, breaking up one argument before it turned into a fight, and generally making himself useful. When the last customers finally left around midnight, he helped her clean up without being asked. "You don't have to keep doing this," Mei-Lin said, washing glasses in the basin behind the bar. "Doing what?" "Helping, protecting, acting like I'm someone worth all this trouble." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally. "You can tell me anything." 3 years ago, I lost my wife," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Fever took her, quick and mean. We'd been married 5 years, had started talking about children, had plans for expanding the ranch. Then she was gone, and all those plans died with her." Mei-Lin stopped washing, giving him her full attention. "For 2 years after, I barely left my property," Ethan continued. "Worked myself near to death during the day, drank myself unconscious at night. Figured that's what the rest of my life looked like. Just getting through one day at a time until the getting through got easier or I died trying." "What changed?" Mei-Lin asked softly. "I came into town one day for supplies," Ethan said. "Stopped in at the Phoenix because it was closer than the other saloons. And there you were, running this place alone, handling drunks and cheats and all manner of trouble with this quiet strength that made my 2 years of feeling sorry for myself look pathetic. You were surviving worse odds than I ever faced, and you did it with your head up and your dignity intact." He met her eyes across the bar. "So when you ask why I help, why I keep coming back, why I act like you're worth the trouble, it's because watching you reminded me that surviving isn't the end of the story, that there's a difference between just not dying and actually living. You showed me that, probably without meaning to, seemed only right to return the favor." Mei-Lin felt her carefully constructed walls trembling. "I'm not some noble survivor," she said. "I'm just doing what I have to do to keep food on my table and a roof over my head." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but the how matters. The way you do it with pride instead of shame, with strategy instead of surrender, that matters." They stood in the quiet saloon, the space between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Finally, Mei-Lin broke the silence. "Your wife," she said. "What was her name?" "Caroline." "Would she have approved of you spending time here helping me?" Ethan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Caroline would have been the first one here this morning with a broom and bucket. She had strong opinions about doing right by people, especially people the town tried to ignore. Would have driven her crazy watching you struggle alone for 2 years." "She sounds like she was a good woman." "The best I've known," Ethan said. "Until recently." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Mei-Lin felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. Part fear, part hope, part something she didn't have a name for. "Ethan, I know," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. I know you've got a business to run and a reputation to protect. I know I'm probably overstepping by even saying this much. But I also know that life's too short and too hard to pretend we don't feel what we feel." "And what do you feel?" Mei-Lin asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like maybe we're both tired of being alone," Ethan said. "I feel like maybe two people who've survived their share of hard times might understand each other better than most. And I feel like, if I don't at least tell you that I'd like to know you better. Not as a customer, not as someone who helps out, but as a man who's interested in a remarkable woman. I'd regret it the rest of my life." Oh, Mei-Lin's hands were shaking. She set down the glass she'd been holding before she dropped it. This town will talk no matter what we do," Ethan said. "They'll talk if we court proper. They'll talk if we don't. They'll make up stories either way. Question is whether we let their talking determine how we live our lives." He had a point. The town had talked when Chen died. They'd talked when she kept the saloon open. They'd talked about everything she did and most of what she didn't do. Their opinion of her had been set in stone the moment she'd arrived. An immigrant, a woman, someone who didn't fit their narrow ideas of respectability. Until yesterday when she'd shown them something they couldn't ignore. "I need time," she said finally. "To think, to make sure this is wise and not just what? Just two lonely people mistaking companionship for something more." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's fair. That's more than fair. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the bar. "But Mei-Lin, while you're thinking, remember that wisdom and happiness don't always look the same. Sometimes the wise choice is the safe choice, and sometimes the wise choice is taking a chance on something real. He left her standing in the empty saloon, surrounded by clean floors and organized bottles, and the lingering scent of soap and bourbon. Maylin finished the washing, locked up, and climbed the stairs to her private rooms. She changed into her nightgown and brushed out her hair, going through the motions of her evening ritual while her mind churned through everything Ethan had said. She'd been alone so long that solitude felt like safety. Trusting no one meant no one could betray her. Needing nothing meant she couldn't be disappointed when promises proved empty. But it also meant never knowing if something better might exist beyond the walls she'd built. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the Montana sky. The same stars her mother had seen in China. The same stars that had guided her ship across the Pacific. The same stars that had witnessed every loss and every small victory of her 25 years. They offered no answers. They never did. But they reminded her that the universe was vast and strange and full of possibilities she couldn't predict. Maybe that was enough. Maylin climbed into bed and closed her eyes, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept replaying moments. Boone Cutter's hand on her wrist, the sound of breaking glass, the chemical fog choking her would-be attackers, Ethan's gray eyes as he confessed feelings she didn't quite know how to receive. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Another answered. And in the jail at the edge of town, 7 men who'd underestimated her slept behind iron bars, learning the hard way that some survivors bite back. The marshal arrived on the 5th day, riding into Redemption Gulch on a gray horse that looked as weathered and no-nonsense as its rider. Marshal Thomas Bridger was a man in his 50s with a face carved from hard experience and eyes that missed nothing. He'd tracked outlaws from the Canadian border to the Mexican territories, and his reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. Maylin watched from her window as he dismounted outside the sheriff's office, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body had absorbed too many bullets over the years. She'd been expecting him. Sheriff McCready had warned her the federal law would want statements about the capture of Boone Cutter's gang. But expectation didn't make the prospect less daunting. Federal marshals asked questions. They dug into details. And details had a way of revealing truths that were better left buried. She was inventorying the stock behind the bar when he entered the Golden Phoenix an hour later, his boots announcing him before she turned around. He removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing gray hair cut military short. "Mrs. Zhao," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I'm Marshal Bridger. I'd like to ask you some questions about the events of this past week, if you have the time." "I have time," Maylin said, setting down her ledger. "Would you like something to drink while we talk?" "Coffee, if you have it. Black." She poured him a cup from the pot she kept heating on the small stove in the back, then poured one for herself. They sat at one of the tables near the window, the afternoon light slanting across the scarred wood between them. Bridger pulled out a small notebook and a pencil worn down to a stub. "Sheriff McCready gave me his version of events, but I'd like to hear yours. Start with the afternoon Boone Cutter and his men came into your establishment." Maylin told him, choosing her words with care. She described the demand for free whiskey, the threats, the moment when violence seemed inevitable. And then, she took a breath, she described pouring drinks from a special bottle and watching 4 armed men collapse into drugged sleep. Bridger's pencil stopped moving. "Drugged," he repeated, his tone neutral. "My late husband was trained in traditional medicine," Maylin said, meeting his eyes. "He created tonics, remedies. This was one of them, herbs meant to bring sleep. I kept it after he died, not knowing what else to do with it. And you just happened to have it available when these men threatened you. I knew where it was kept. I made a choice in the moment. A choice that could be interpreted as poisoning," Bridger said, still watching her carefully. "A choice that prevented bloodshed," Maylin countered. 4 armed men against 1 woman. If I tried to fight them with a gun, people would have died. Maybe me, maybe them, maybe both. Instead, everyone walked away breathing." Bridger wrote something in his notebook. "And the second incident? The attempted arson?" She described that night too, the sound of breaking glass, the chemical fog, the rifle shot that had stopped just short of causing real harm. As she spoke, she watched his face for signs of judgment, condemnation, the kind of reaction she'd learned to expect from men with authority. What she saw instead was calculation. You've had quite a week, he said when she finished. I've survived quite a week, Maylin corrected. Bridger smiled, a quick flash of expression that transformed his stern features. Fair point. He flipped back through his notes. Here's my situation, Mrs. Zhao. I've got 7 wanted men in custody, including Boone Cutter, who's got federal paper on him for robbery, assault, and suspected murder in 3 territories. The bounty on his head alone is $500. The others bring the total up past $1,000. Maylin's breath caught. $1,000 was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. Problem is, Bridger continued, I need to write a report that explains how these dangerous criminals ended up unconscious or running scared. The truth, that a woman half their size outsmarted them with chemistry and herbs, that's going to raise questions. Questions about whether the capture was legal, whether evidence will hold up in court, whether defense lawyers can claim their clients were unlawfully detained. So you want me to lie, Maylin said flatly. I want you to help me frame the truth in a way that keeps these men behind bars, Bridger said, because if I write this up the way it actually happened, some judge in Helena might decide you overstepped, might rule the whole capture invalid, and then Boone Cutter walks free, and the next woman he terrorizes might not be as resourceful as you. Maylin sipped her coffee, thinking. What are you proposing? I propose we say that you served them regular whiskey, and they got so drunk on empty stomachs they passed out, which is technically true. They did drink what you served them, and they did pass out. The mechanism is just simplified. Bridger leaned forward. As for the second incident, we say you used cleaning chemicals to create a smokescreen that drove them out, then held them at gunpoint until the sheriff arrived. Again, true. Just lacking certain creative details. And in exchange for this simplified truth? In exchange, I make sure the bounty money gets paid out to you as the person responsible for their capture. I write a report commending your courage and quick thinking. And I have a conversation with Sheriff McCready about making sure you don't face any more trouble from men who think a woman running a business is an invitation for violence. Maylin studied his face, looking for the trap she'd learned to expect in generous offers. Why would you do this for me? Bridger's expression softened. 20 years ago, I had a wife. Sarah. Strongest woman I ever knew. She ran a boarding house in Denver while I chased outlaws across the frontier. Kept that place running through every hardship you can imagine. Economic panics, cholera outbreaks, floods that took half the town. And the whole time, men looked down on her for being in business, treated her like she was less because she worked with her hands and made her own way. He paused, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. She died of pneumonia while I was tracking a gang in Wyoming. By the time I got the telegram and made it back to Denver, she'd been in the ground 3 weeks. And you know what I learned going through her papers? That half the men in Denver owed her money they'd never intended to pay. That the bank had tried to foreclose on her building twice, using excuses they'd never have used on a male property owner. That she'd been fighting battles I never knew about because she'd been too proud to tell me she needed help. Bridger met Maylin's eyes. So when I see a woman like you, working twice as hard for half the respect, keeping your business alive through pure determination, defending yourself because no one else will, I figure the least I can do is make sure the law doesn't punish you for being competent. Consider it an apology to my wife for all the times I wasn't there when she needed me. Maylin felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the suspicion she'd carried like armor for so long. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. I'm sorry for yours, Bridger replied. And I'm sorry this town made you fight alone as long as it did. But that's changing from what I hear. Half the people I've talked to today have had nothing but praise for how you handled yourself. The other half are too scared of you to say anything at all, which is almost as good. Despite everything, Maylin smiled. Fear and respect often look similar. They do indeed. Bridger finished his coffee and stood, settling his hat back on his head. I'll be in town another 2 days, taking statements and arranging transport for the prisoners. The bounty money should arrive within the month. You have any trouble before then? You come, find me. After I leave, you send a telegram to the marshal's office in Helena. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here, Mrs. Zhao. You've earned your place 10 times over. After he left, Maylin sat alone at the table, staring at her reflection in the coffee cup and trying to process the strange reality of federal law enforcement treating her like a citizen instead of a nuisance. The bounty money was real. The marshal's protection was real. And the change she'd sensed in the town's attitude toward her was apparently real enough that even outsiders could see it. The afternoon crowd began arriving around 4, a lighter turnout than the previous days, but steady. Ethan came in at his usual time, took his usual table, and ordered his usual beer, but when she brought it to him, he said something unusual. "I'm having a problem at my ranch," he said. "Was hoping you might help me solve it." Maylin set down the beer, surprised. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where I'm a terrible cook, and I'm getting tired of burning everything I try to make for dinner." He smiled, a shy expression that made him look younger. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to come out Sunday afternoon. Let me make you a meal that's probably going to be half charred. We could talk, away from the saloon, away from everyone watching and whispering." It was an invitation and a question and a risk all wrapped together. Maylin's first instinct was to refuse. Going to a man's ranch unchaperoned would set tongues wagging harder than they already were. But then she remembered Bridger's words about earning her place, and Mary Catherine's confession about being afraid of what people would say, and her own realization that other people's opinions had controlled her life for far too long. "What time Sunday?" she asked. Ethan's smile widened. 2 o'clock? "I'll come fetch you with the wagon. It's about an hour's ride." "I'll be ready." She walked back to the bar feeling something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Anticipation, maybe, or hope, or the strange sensation of choosing something for herself rather than just surviving the choices others made for her. The next 2 days passed in a blur of normal business punctuated by extraordinary moments. The marshal interviewed half the town, his presence lending an official weight to events that might otherwise have faded into rumor and exaggeration. The Chinese miners from the camp came in as a group, speaking to Maylin in rapid Cantonese and leaving generous tips they could barely afford. Mary Catherine organized a group of women to help Maylin with the heavier cleaning and repairs she'd been putting off for months. And everywhere Maylin went, to the general store for supplies, to the bank to deposit her earnings, to the post office to mail a letter to a cousin in San Francisco, people nodded to her. Some even tipped their hats. The transformation from invisible outsider to visible citizen was so complete and so sudden that she almost didn't trust it. Saturday evening, as she was closing up the saloon, Sheriff McCready appeared at her door. He looked uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting with his hat brim. "Mrs. Zhao," he said, "got a minute?" She let him in and poured him a whiskey without asking, having learned that McCready functioned better with alcohol smoothing his words. "I owe you an apology," he said abruptly, not touching the drink. "Been sheriff of this town 5 years, and in all that time I never once checked on you, never asked if you were having trouble, never did my job when it came to making sure you were safe." Maylin waited, saying nothing. "The marshal pointed that out to me," McCready continued. "Asked me how many times men had harassed you, cheated you, caused trouble in your establishment. Asked me what I'd done about it, and the answer was nothing. I'd done nothing because I figured a Chinese woman running a saloon wasn't really my concern. That you'd chosen that life and whatever came with it was your problem." He finally met her eyes. "That was wrong. That was me failing at the job I swore to do. And I'm sorry. Moving forward, you have trouble, you come get me. Day or night, drunk or sober, you come get me, and I'll handle it. That's a promise." "Promises are easy to make," Maylin said carefully. "Harder to keep." "That's fair. That's more than fair." McCready picked up the whiskey and downed it in one swallow. "So I'll prove it with actions instead of words. I'm making it known around town that anyone who causes trouble at the Golden Phoenix answers to me personally, and I'm stationing one of my deputies to do a nightly walk past here, just to make sure no one gets ideas." "I can protect myself," Maylin said. "I know you can. You've proven that thoroughly, but you shouldn't have to." McCready set down the glass and picked up his hat. "That's all I came to say. Good evening, Mrs. Zhao." He left her standing behind her bar, wondering if she'd somehow stumbled into a different town where sheriffs apologized and marshals offered protection and women with brooms showed up to help clean. Sunday morning, Maylin woke with nervous energy crackling through her veins. She changed her dress 3 times, settling finally on a simple blue cotton that was nice without being fancy, practical without being plain. She brushed her hair until it shone, then wound it into a neat bun at the base of her neck. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman preparing for something that might be a mistake, but felt necessary anyway. Ethan arrived promptly at 2 with a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He'd cleaned up too, she noticed. Fresh shirt, shaved jaw, hair combed back. He helped her onto the wagon seat with a gentleness that suggested he knew exactly how significant this moment was. The ride out to his ranch took them through landscape that reminded Maylin why people endured the hardships of frontier life. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks still snow-capped despite the summer heat. Meadows spread wide and green, dotted with wildflowers that turned the fields into living quilts. A creek ran parallel to the road for several miles, its water clear enough to see the stones on the bottom. "It's beautiful," Maylin said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "It is," Ethan agreed, "though it can be a lonely kind of beautiful when you're experiencing it alone." His ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. A simple house with a covered porch, a barn that looked recently painted, corrals holding a dozen cattle, and fields that showed signs of careful cultivation. It was the home of a man who took pride in his work without being flashy about it. Ethan helped her down from the wagon and led her to the porch, where 2 chairs sat angled to catch the view. "I should warn you," he said, "I wasn't joking about being a terrible cook. I've got beef that's probably going to be tougher than leather, and potatoes that might be burnt on the outside and raw in the middle." "Then it's good I brought insurance," Maylin said, producing a basket from beneath her seat. "Bread from this morning and some of the vegetables I keep in the saloon's cold storage." Ethan's face lit up. "You're a miracle worker, you know that?" They worked together in his small kitchen, Maylin salvaging his cooking attempts and transforming them into something edible, while Ethan set the table and told stories about his ranch, his cattle, the challenges of making a living from land that didn't give up its bounty easily. "Caroline and I bought this place right after we got married," he said, slicing the bread she'd brought. "It was even more run down then. Roof leaked, barn was falling apart, fields were full of rocks. But she saw what it could be, had this vision of a place where we could raise children and build something that would outlast us." "Do you still see that vision?" Maylin asked gently. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Some days. Other days I just see the work that needs doing and wonder why I keep at it." He looked at her across the kitchen. "But lately, especially this past week, I've been thinking maybe the vision just needs updating. Maybe it's not about recreating what I lost, but about creating something new." They ate on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The food was simple but good, and the conversation flowed easier than Maylin had expected. Ethan asked about her childhood in China, and she found herself telling stories she hadn't shared in years, about her mother's garden, her father's failed businesses, the day she'd been told she was going to America, and had both dreaded and desperately hoped it would be true. "I was 15, she said, watching the sun paint the mountains red. "Old enough to understand I was being sold, young enough to still believe it might lead somewhere better. My father told me America was a land of opportunity, that a smart girl could make her own fortune there." "He wasn't entirely wrong," Ethan said. "You did make your own fortune, just had to fight harder for it than he probably imagined." "I fought for survival," Maylin corrected. "Fortune is what happens when survival becomes something more." "And has it? Become something more?" Maylin considered the question. A week ago, she would have said no, that survival was all she had and all she could expect. But now, sitting on a porch with a man who looked at her like she mattered, in a town that had finally decided to see her as human, with bounty money coming that would give her real financial security for the first time in her life. Maybe survival was transforming into something else after all. "It's starting to," she admitted. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent, darkness creeping across the valley below. Ethan lit a lantern, and in its golden glow, Maylin studied his face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, the scar on his chin from some long-ago accident, the way his expression softened when he looked at her. "Can I be honest with you about something?" Ethan said finally. "Please." "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared of feeling something real for someone again. Scared of losing it like I lost Caroline. Scared of pushing too hard and driving you away, but also scared of not pushing hard enough and missing something that could matter." Maylin reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers strong from years of ranch work. "I'm scared too," she said. "Scared of trusting someone enough to let them close. Scared that this town's acceptance is temporary and will disappear the moment I do something they don't approve of. Scared that caring about you makes me vulnerable in ways I can't afford." "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. "We choose courage over fear," Maylin said. "We take this one day at a time and see where it leads. We don't make promises we can't keep, but we don't run from possibilities because they might hurt." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I can live with that." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out in their thousands, talking about everything and nothing: his plans for expanding the ranch, her ideas for improving the saloon, the small joys and large frustrations of making a life in territory that was still half wild. And somewhere in those hours, something shifted between them from possibility to reality, from maybe to yes. When Ethan drove her back to town, the night was full dark, and the streets of Redemption Gulch were mostly empty. He helped her down from the wagon in front of the Golden Phoenix, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," he said quietly, "for taking a chance." "Thank you for asking me to," Maylin replied. She watched him drive away, the wagon's lantern bobbing in the darkness until it disappeared around a corner. Then she let herself into the saloon, locked the door behind her, and climbed the stairs to her private rooms with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the physical weight of her body. Change, she was learning, didn't always announce itself with drama and violence. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of a hand held on a porch, a conversation that lasted until stars filled the sky, a choice to trust when trust felt dangerous. She changed into her nightgown and sat by her window, looking out at the town that had finally decided she belonged in it. The marshal would leave tomorrow, taking his prisoners to face justice in Helena. The bounty money would arrive within weeks, enough to expand the saloon or buy property or simply exist without the constant fear of one bad month destroying everything she'd built. And Ethan would come back to the Phoenix not just as a customer but as something more, a man who'd shared his grief and his hope, who'd invited her into his life and his future, who looked at her and saw not a foreign widow running a questionable business, but a remarkable woman worth knowing. It was, Maylin thought, more than she'd dared hope for when she'd stood behind the bar 5 days ago and poured 4 shots of drugged whiskey for men who'd meant to break her. She'd survived violence with strategy and fear with resolve. She'd protected what was hers and earned respect from people who'd never thought her worthy of it. And now, impossibly, she was beginning to believe that survival might transform into something richer, a life built on her own terms, in her own way, with people who valued her for exactly who she was. The green bottle still sat on its high shelf downstairs, empty now, but kept as a reminder of the night everything changed. Maylin closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a future where that bottle stayed empty, where threats were answered by a community instead of by her alone, where the stranger in the red silk dress became simply Maylin, citizen of Redemption Gulch, owner of the Golden Phoenix, woman who'd earned her place through courage and cleverness and sheer stubborn refusal to break. It was a good future, a possible future, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maylin felt something dangerous and wonderful unfurling in her chest. Hope. Hope, Maylin discovered over the following weeks, was more dangerous than fear. Fear kept you cautious, made you plan for the worst, built walls that protected tender places. Hope made you vulnerable. It asked you to believe in futures that hadn't happened yet, to trust in people who might disappoint, to open doors you'd spent years learning to keep locked. But hope also made the work lighter and the days brighter, and the sound of Ethan's boots on her porch something worth listening for. The bounty money arrived on a Thursday morning in early August, delivered by a federal courier who made Maylin sign 3 separate documents confirming receipt. $1,047 in banknotes, crisp and official, more money than she'd ever held at once in her entire life. She stood in her private rooms with the cash spread across her bed, staring at it like it might disappear if she looked away. This was security. This was choice. This was the difference between surviving month to month and actually planning for a future that extended beyond next winter's fuel bill. Mary Catherine found her there an hour later, still standing frozen beside the bed. "Maylin? The door was unlocked and you didn't answer when I called." She stopped, taking in the money and Maylene's stunned expression. "Oh, it came. It came," Maylene confirmed, her voice strange to her own ears. Mary Catherine stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," Maylene admitted. "I've been standing here trying to decide. Part of me wants to hide it away, keep it safe for emergencies. Part of me wants to expand the saloon, buy better stock, maybe fix the roof before winter. And part of me—" She stopped, the thought too new and fragile to speak aloud. "Part of you wants to use it to build something bigger than just the business," Mary Catherine finished gently. "Something that includes the life you're starting with Ethan." Maylene looked at her friend. When had Mary Catherine become a friend instead of just a customer? And nodded. "Is that foolish? To think about a future that might not happen? To plan for possibilities instead of certainties?" "That's called living," Mary Catherine said. "The rest of us have been doing it for years. About time you joined us." They counted the money together, sorting it into denominations and discussing options. Mary Catherine, it turned out, had a practical mind for finance that her demure exterior concealed. She suggested Maylene deposit half in the bank for safety, use a quarter for immediate business improvements, and keep the final quarter liquid for opportunities or emergencies. "And maybe," Mary Catherine added carefully, "set aside a little for a new dress, something that's not work clothes or the red silk you wear every day. Something that's just for you." Maylene ran her fingers over the faded fabric of her dress. Chen's favorite, worn so many times the seams showed white from strain. "I wouldn't know what to choose." "Then let me help," Mary Catherine said. "That's what friends do." The words settled between them like a gift. Friends. Maylene had colleagues, customers, business associates. But friends, people who helped without expecting payment, who cared about your happiness beyond how it affected them, that was new territory. "I would like that," Maylene said quietly. They went to Mary Catherine's dress shop that afternoon, Maylene leaving the saloon in Silas's care, with instructions to serve drinks and keep the peace. The shop was small but well organized, with fabrics arranged by color and type, dress forms displaying the latest fashions from catalogs that were only 6 months out of date. "Here," Mary Catherine said, pulling a bolt of deep green silk from the shelf. "This would be stunning with your coloring. We could make it up in a simple style. Nothing too fussy, but elegant. Something you could wear to church socials or town gatherings." "I don't go to church socials," Maylene pointed out. "You could start," Mary Catherine countered. "The town's changed how it sees you, Maylene. People want to include you now. The harvest dance is next month. Wouldn't hurt to have something nice to wear." Maylene touched the silk, feeling its coolness against her work-roughened fingers. The idea of attending a town dance, of moving through social spaces she'd been excluded from for 2 years, felt both terrifying and appealing. "Ethan would have to ask me." "Ethan will ask you," Mary Catherine said with certainty. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon. Trust me, he'll ask." They spent the afternoon choosing fabric and discussing patterns, and by the time Maylene returned to the Golden Phoenix, she'd commissioned not 1, but 2 new dresses. The green silk for special occasions and a practical brown cotton for daily wear. The cost made her wince despite the bounty money in the bank, years of poverty making any expenditure on herself feel like dangerous indulgence. But Mary Catherine had insisted, and some part of Maylene that had been buried under survival and practicality whispered that maybe she deserved beautiful things simply because she wanted them. The saloon that evening was busier than usual, filled with miners fresh from the camp and homesteaders in town for supplies. Maylene worked the bar with practiced efficiency, pouring drinks and making change, while half her mind calculated profits, and the other half wondered if Ethan would stop by. He did, just after 8, taking his usual table but ordering something different. "2 beers," he said when she approached, "and whatever you're having for yourself. I'd like to talk to you when you get a break." Maylene's stomach did something complicated. Conversations that started with "I'd like to talk" rarely led anywhere good, but Ethan's expression held no warning signs, no tension around his eyes, no careful neutral tone that suggested bad news. She poured 3 beers and carried them to his table, then pulled up a chair across from him. Around them, the saloon hummed with conversations and the clink of glasses, providing a kind of privacy through sheer noise. I have a proposition, Ethan said without preamble, and I want you to hear me out before you say no. I'm listening. My ranch does well enough, but it could do better with proper investment, upgrading the irrigation, expanding the herd, maybe building a second barn for hay storage. Problem is, I don't have capital for those improvements. Banks won't lend to cattle ranchers unless you've got collateral they like, and my land's mortgaged to the limit already. Maylin sipped her beer, waiting. You've got money now, Ethan continued, the bounty payment. And I'm guessing you're thinking about how to invest it smart, put it somewhere it'll grow instead of just sitting in a bank earning minimal interest. Are you asking me to invest in your ranch? Maylin asked carefully. I'm asking if you want to become a partner, Ethan said. Not a silent investor, an actual partner. You put in capital for improvements, I put in the land and labor. We split the profits proportional to investment, say 60-40 in your favor to account for the cash you're risking. Why would you offer that? Maylin asked. You could find other investors, men who wouldn't require you to share ownership. I could, Ethan agreed, but I don't want other investors. I want a partner I trust, someone smart who understands business and risk, someone who won't try to control everything just because they've got money in the venture. He met her eyes. Someone I care about building a future with, whether that future's romantic or just professional. Either way, I'd rather share success with you than have all of something smaller alone. Maylin's heart was hammering now because this was more than a business proposition. This was Ethan saying he wanted their lives entwined, wanted to build something together that would last beyond whatever happened between them personally. I'd need to see the books, she said. Understand the full financial picture before committing. Absolutely. I'll bring everything to you tomorrow. Expenses, income, debts, projections. You can take all the time you need to decide. And if things between us don't work out, Maylin asked, if we try this, whatever this is, and it fails? Ethan considered the question seriously. Then we'd be business partners who used to be something more. Happens all the time. People manage it. We're both adults who can separate business from personal. He paused. But Maylin, I don't think we're going to fail. I think we're going to surprise ourselves with how well we work together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the hope unfurling in her chest was wisdom instead of foolishness. Let me see the books, she said finally. Let me understand what I'd be getting into. Fair enough, Ethan said, and the smile that crossed his face was pure relief. They finished their beers while discussing details. How much capital the improvements would require, what timeline made sense, how they'd structure the partnership legally to protect both parties. It was practical conversation about practical matters, but underneath ran a current of something else entirely. They were planning a shared future, building a foundation for lives that would intersect and intertwine. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the saloon with a canvas bag full of ledgers, receipts, and documents. Maylin spread them across a table and began the painstaking work of analysis, checking figures and tracing expense patterns. She'd learned bookkeeping from Chen, who'd been meticulous about records even as opium destroyed his ability to manage the actual business. What she found surprised her. Ethan's ranch was profitable but constrained. He made just enough to cover expenses and modest improvements, but never enough to make the large investments that would increase productivity significantly. He paid his debts on time, maintained his equipment properly, and kept detailed records that showed a mind for careful management. It was exactly the kind of operation that would thrive with capital injection and exactly the kind of partner she could trust with her money. Your numbers are good, she told him when he returned that afternoon. Conservative projections, realistic expense estimates. If we make the improvements you're proposing, I think we could increase your yield by 30% within 2 years. So you're considering it? Ethan asked. I'm considering it, Maylin confirmed. But I want terms drawn up properly. Legal documents that protect both of us. I'll need to consult with a lawyer. Already thought of that, Ethan said, producing a business card from his pocket. Daniel Morrison. He's honest, charges fair rates, and he doesn't have issues doing business with women or Chinese folks. Figured we could both meet with him, explain what we want, and have him draw up partnership papers that cover all the contingencies. Maylin took the card, impressed despite herself. Ethan had thought this through, anticipated her concerns, and already solved the problems she'd been about to raise. You've been planning this for a while. Since the bounty money was announced, Ethan admitted. Seemed like an opportunity for both of us. You to grow your capital, me to grow my operation. Plus, it gives us a reason to see each other regular that's not just courting. Takes some pressure off, maybe. Makes things easier. He was giving her an exit route, Maylin realized. A way to maintain connection without the vulnerability of pure romance. If she wanted to keep him at arm's length, the business partnership would allow that. If she wanted more, well, partners spent a lot of time together. "When can we meet with this lawyer?" she asked. They met with Daniel Morrison 2 days later in his modest office above the general store. Morrison was a thin man in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the patient demeanor of someone who spent his days explaining legal concepts to people who'd never needed a lawyer before. "A ranch partnership between unmarried parties," he said, tapping his pencil against his notepad. "Unusual, but not unheard of. We'll want to be very clear about profit distribution, decision-making authority, and dissolution procedures." For the next 2 hours, they worked through details Maylin hadn't even considered. What happened if one partner died? If they married each other versus other people? If the ranch failed despite their best efforts? If they disagreed on major decisions? Morrison asked questions that forced them to imagine every possible future, pleasant and unpleasant, and decide in advance how they'd handle it. By the time they finished, Maylin's head was spinning with contingencies and clauses, but she also felt oddly secure. Whatever happened between her and Ethan personally, the business arrangement would protect them both. "I'll have the papers drawn up by end of week," Morrison said. "You'll both need to sign in front of witnesses, and Mrs. Zhao, you'll need to have your banker confirm the capital transfer in writing." Walking back to the Golden Phoenix afterward, Ethan was quiet. Finally, he spoke. "That was more complicated than I expected." "Legal protection usually is," Maylin said. "Made me think about all the ways this could go wrong," Ethan admitted. "All the futures where we're not, where we don't." He stopped, struggling for words. Maylin stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing on the wooden sidewalk outside the hardware store, afternoon sun slanting between buildings to paint golden squares on the dusty street. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "About the partnership? No? About us?" Ethan shook his head. "Just the opposite. Sitting in that office, planning for every possible future, all I could think was that the only future I want is one where we figure this out together. Where the legal documents stay in a drawer collecting dust because we never need the protections they offer." "That's what I want too," Maylin said quietly. "But wanting and having aren't the same thing." "No," Ethan agreed. "But maybe we get closer to having by being brave enough to want." He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked the rest of the way to the Golden Phoenix like that. A man and a woman, a rancher and a saloon keeper, 2 people building something fragile and hopeful in the space between what they'd lost and what they might yet find. The partnership papers were signed the following Tuesday in Morrison's office, with Mary Catherine and Silas serving as witnesses. Maylin transferred $500 to a joint account she and Ethan established for ranch improvements, keeping the rest of her bounty money in reserve. It was simultaneously the most money she'd ever spent, and the most concrete investment she'd ever made in a future that extended beyond immediate survival. "To partnership," Ethan said afterward, shaking her hand with mock formality outside the bank. "To partnership," Maylin echoed, and tried to ignore how right her hand felt in his. The first improvement they funded was irrigation expansion, pipes and ditches that would carry water from the creek to fields that had always depended on unreliable rainfall. Ethan hired workers from town, paying fair wages that made him popular among men who usually struggled for steady employment. Maylin rode out to the ranch twice a week to check on progress, ostensibly as an investor protecting her capital, but really because she'd come to love the place. She loved the way evening light turned the mountains purple and gold. She loved the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the smell of hay drying in the fields. She loved sitting on Ethan's porch with coffee and ledgers, discussing crop rotation and market prices while the day cooled around them. And she was beginning to love, though she hadn't said it aloud yet, the man who'd built this life with his hands and his stubbornness, who looked at her like she was the best investment he'd ever made and the smartest partner he could imagine. The harvest dance arrived on a Saturday in late September when the air had begun to cool, but the earth still held summer's warmth. Maylin wore her new green silk dress, and Mary Catherine had done her hair in a style that was elegant without being fussy. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like a woman going courting instead of a saloon keeper going to work. Ethan arrived to collect her at 6, driving the wagon he'd polished until it gleamed. He wore a suit she'd never seen before, dark wool that fit him well and made his gray eyes even more striking. When he saw her, he stopped on her threshold like he'd forgotten how to move. "You're beautiful," he said finally, the words simple and devastating in their sincerity. "You clean up well yourself," Mei Lin replied, trying for lightness to cover the way her heart was racing. The dance was held in the town hall, a large room that had been decorated with paper streamers and lanterns. Half of Redemption Gulch seemed to be there, dressed in their finest clothes and moving through social rituals that felt foreign to Mei Lin despite 2 years of living among these people. But this time was different. This time, when she entered on Ethan's arm, people didn't whisper and turn away. They nodded. They smiled. Several women approached to compliment her dress, and Tom Fletcher actually tipped his hat. "You're one of us now," Mary Catherine said, appearing at her elbow. About time everyone realized it. The music started, a fiddle and guitar playing songs Mei Lin didn't know but could feel the rhythm of. Ethan led her onto the floor for a simple waltz, and she stumbled through the steps while he guided her patiently. "I don't know how to dance," she admitted, stepping on his foot for the 3rd time. "Neither do I," Ethan confessed. "I'm just moving and hoping it looks intentional." That made her laugh. And suddenly the dance became less about proper steps and more about moving together, finding a rhythm that worked for them, even if it didn't match anyone else's. They swayed more than waltzed, improvised more than followed form, and Mei Lin felt something loosen in her chest, some final knot of tension she'd been carrying since arriving in this town. She belonged here, not because the town had finally deigned to accept her, but because she'd claimed her place through courage and competence and sheer stubborn refusal to disappear. And now, impossibly, she was dancing at a harvest celebration with a man who made her believe in futures she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. Later, when they'd exhausted themselves with dancing and escaped to the porch for cool air, Ethan took her hand. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice serious enough to send worry skittering through her veins. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," Ethan said simply. "Have been for weeks, probably. Maybe longer. And I know it's fast and complicated and there are 100 reasons to go slow, but I'm tired of pretending what I feel is just partnership or friendship or anything other than what it actually is." Mei Lin's breath caught. Around them, the sounds of the dance continued. Music and laughter and the stomp of boots on wooden floors. But in this moment, on this porch, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Ethan said. "So am I. But I'm more scared of letting you go without telling you how I feel. Of looking back someday and regretting that I wasn't brave enough to risk my heart when it mattered." Mei Lin looked at him, this good man who'd helped her when no one else would, who'd offered partnership before romance, who'd been patient with her walls and gentle with her fears. And she thought about the life she'd built through sheer determination, the business she'd saved with chemistry and courage, the future she was creating one careful choice at a time. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, the words feeling both dangerous and right. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But somewhere between you helping me clean up broken glass and sitting on your porch planning irrigation systems, it happened anyway." Ethan's smile was like sunrise. "So what do we do about it?" "We keep being scared," Mei Lin said. "We keep being careful, but we also keep being honest. And we see where that takes us." "I can live with that," Ethan said, and leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their first kiss was soft and sweet, and tasted like hope. And when they finally pulled apart, Mei Lin felt like she'd crossed some invisible threshold into a future she'd never dared imagine. Behind them, the music swelled. Around them, the town celebrated harvest and community and the simple joy of survival into another season. And in Ethan's arms, on a porch in Montana Territory, Mei Lin allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth more than all the gold in California. She'd found home. Home, Mei Lin learned in the months that followed, wasn't a place you found. It was something you built with careful hands and brave choices, one timber at a time. October brought the first hard frost, coating Redemption Gulch in silver and reminding everyone that Montana winters showed no mercy to the unprepared. Maylin spent her mornings managing the saloon and her afternoons at the ranch, watching workers complete the irrigation system before the ground froze solid. The partnership was proving profitable faster than either she or Ethan had projected. Improved water access meant better yields, which meant more cattle could be sustained through winter, which meant greater profits come spring. But it was the other partnership, the one that had nothing to do with ledgers and everything to do with the way Ethan looked at her over morning coffee, that occupied her thoughts during the quiet moments. They were courting now, officially and publicly. Ethan called on her Sunday afternoons, sitting in the saloon's empty space while she prepared for evening service. They took walks through town, his hand at the small of her back, nodding to neighbors who no longer looked surprised to see them together. He kissed her goodnight on her porch, sweet and chaste, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. It was proper and patient and everything courtship was supposed to be. And yet, underneath the propriety ran a current of something deeper, a recognition that they were building toward a question that would eventually need answering. The question arrived on a Wednesday in early November, carried on a telegram from Helena. Maylin was restocking bottles when Sheriff McCready appeared at the saloon door, his expression uncharacteristically grave. "Got news from the territorial court," he said without preamble. "Thought you should hear it direct instead of through gossip." Maylin set down the bottle she was holding, her stomach tightening with premonition. "What news?" "Boone Cutter and his gang stood trial last week. Federal judge sentenced them. Cutter got 20 years hard labor. The others got between 10 and 15. McCready paused. "But there's more. During the trial, Cutter's lawyer tried to argue the arrest was illegal, claimed you'd poisoned his clients, that it constituted assault." Did the judge agree?" Maylin asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "No. Marshal Bridger's testimony held. Judge ruled that serving strong drink to men who demanded it didn't constitute a crime, and what they chose to consume was their own responsibility." McCready pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "But the lawyer also filed a civil suit. Cutter's claiming damages for the drugging, says it caused him physical harm and loss of liberty. He's suing you for $5,000. The number hit Maylin like a physical blow. $5,000 was more than the bounty payment, more than her savings, more than the saloon's value. It was an impossible sum designed to destroy her financially, even if Cutter never collected a cent. "Can he do that?" she asked. "Sue me from prison?" "Unfortunately, yes. Civil court's different from criminal. Man's got the right to file suit, even from behind bars." McCready's expression softened. "But here's the thing. He's got to prove damages, and proving damages means admitting he came here intending violence. The judge and Helena already said the arrest was legal. Hard to imagine a jury awarding money to a convicted criminal who terrorized the woman he's suing." "But not impossible," Maylin said. "Not impossible," McCready admitted, "which is why you need a lawyer, a good one." She found Ethan at the ranch, supervising the construction of the new hay barn. When she told him about the lawsuit, his face went through several expressions: shock, anger, and finally a grim determination that reminded her why she'd trusted him with her partnership and her heart. $5,000, he repeated, like saying it might make it less absurd. "That son of a—" He caught himself, visibly controlling his temper. "This is harassment, pure and simple. He knows he can't win, but he figures he can make you spend money defending yourself. Bleed you dry with legal fees even if the suit fails." "Can I countersue?" Maylin asked. "For the damage his men did to my property? For the trauma of the attack?" "I don't know, but Daniel Morrison will." Ethan was already moving toward the barn to tell the workers he was leaving. "Come on, we're going to town right now." Morrison listened to their explanation with the same patient attention he'd given the partnership negotiations, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. When they finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "This is intimidation disguised as litigation," he said flatly. "Cutter knows the odds of winning are minimal, but he also knows defending against even a baseless suit costs money and time. It's revenge for putting him behind bars." "Can we fight it?" Ethan asked. "Absolutely. And I think we should countersue for damages, emotional distress, and legal fees, turn his harassment back on him." Morrison looked at Maylin. "But I need to be honest with you, Mrs. Zhao. This will get ugly." His lawyer will drag up every aspect of your life, your immigration status, your late husband's opium use, the fact that you run a saloon. They'll try to paint you as an untrustworthy foreigner who poisoned innocent customers. It won't matter that it's false. They'll say it anyway, loudly and publicly, hoping to turn public opinion against you. Maylin felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd worked so hard to earn Redemption Gulch's respect, had finally reached a place where people saw her as a person instead of a category. This lawsuit could undo all of that, could reduce her back to the foreign widow running a questionable establishment. "What if I just paid him?" she asked quietly. "Settled out of court. Made this go away." "No." Ethan's voice was sharp. "You're not rewarding his intimidation with money. It might be cheaper than fighting." "It's not about the money," Ethan interrupted. "It's about principle. You didn't do anything wrong. You defended yourself against men who meant you harm. Paying Cutter would be admitting fault you don't have and guilt you don't deserve." Morrison nodded slowly. "Mr. Cole is right about principle, but Mrs. Zhao is right about practicality. Fighting this could cost several $100s in legal fees, and there's always risk with juries. I'll do my best to get costs awarded to you if we win, but there are no guarantees." Maylin looked between the two men, Morrison with his pragmatic caution, Ethan with his righteous anger. Both were trying to protect her, just in different ways. "I need time to think," she said finally. That evening, the saloon was quieter than usual. Word of the lawsuit had spread through town with the speed of fire through dry grass, and people who'd been friendly last week were suddenly distant again, their expressions careful and neutral. It was like watching 2 years of progress evaporate in the span of hours. Only a few regulars remained, Silas at his usual table, Mary Catherine having her customary sherry, and Ethan sitting near the window with a beer he wasn't drinking. Their loyalty meant something, but it also highlighted how fragile acceptance really was. One lawsuit from a convicted criminal, and half the town was ready to believe the worst of her again. Maylin was cleaning glasses when the door opened to admit someone she'd never seen before. A woman in her 40s, well-dressed in traveling clothes, with the kind of tired elegance that spoke of money that had once been abundant but was now carefully managed. She looked around the saloon with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then walked directly to the bar. "Mrs. Zhao?" she asked, her voice carrying the clipped accent of Eastern education. "Yes. Can I help you?" "My name is Catherine Bridger," the woman said. "Marshall Thomas Bridger was my husband. I've come from Denver because I heard about the lawsuit, and I wanted to speak with you." Maylin's hand stilled on the glass she'd been drying. "The Marshall's wife?" "Widow, actually. Thomas died 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out while he was tracking cattle thieves near the Wyoming border." Catherine's voice was steady, but her eyes held the particular emptiness of fresh grief. "I only learned about what happened here in Redemption Gulch when I was going through his papers. He'd written a letter to his superior recommending you for a civilian citation for bravery. Called you one of the most resourceful people he'd ever met." Maylin felt tears threaten and blinked them back fiercely. "I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man." "He was," Catherine agreed, "and he would be furious about this lawsuit. Absolutely furious, which is why I'm here." She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Thomas kept meticulous notes on every case. This contains his full documentation of the Cutter gang capture, interviews with witnesses, assessment of the crime scene, everything. He also wrote a detailed affidavit stating that in his professional opinion, your actions were justified self-defense, and that Cutter's gang posed a lethal threat. She set the envelope on the bar between them. "I'm not a lawyer," Catherine continued, "but I've been married to law enforcement long enough to know this documentation will demolish any civil suit Cutter tries to bring. No jury will side with a convicted criminal over a federal marshal's sworn testimony, especially when that marshal has a reputation for absolute honesty." Maylin stared at the envelope like it might disappear. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "I know enough," Catherine said. "I know you're a woman alone making her way in a world that doesn't make it easy. I know you defended yourself with intelligence instead of violence. And I know my husband respected you, which is more than he felt for most people." She paused. "And I know what it's like to be judged for choices men never have to justify. I spent 20 years running a boarding house while people whispered that I was improper for being in business. If I can prevent another woman from being punished for surviving, I will. I don't know how to thank you, Maylin whispered. Win your case, Catherine said simply. And when you do, remember to help the next woman who needs it. That's thanks enough. She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, disappearing into the November twilight. Maylin stood holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it. Not just physical weight, but the weight of Marshall Bridger's final gift, of Catherine's determination to honor her husband by helping a stranger, of the strange ways grace appeared when you most needed it. Ethan appeared at her elbow. Who was that? An answer, Maylin said. Morrison read through Bridger's documentation with increasing satisfaction, occasionally making appreciative noises. This is exceptional, he said finally. Detailed, professional, unimpeachable. With this testimony, we don't just defend, we attack. We file a countersuit for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. We make Cutter regret ever filing this frivolous case. The legal proceedings moved with the glacial pace of territorial justice. Papers were filed, responses drafted, depositions taken. Cutter's lawyer tried every trick: character assassination, procedural delays, attempts to exclude Bridger's testimony on technicalities. But Morrison met each challenge with calm competence, and the documentation Catherine had provided proved unassailable. The trial was set for January in the territorial court at Helena, which meant Maylin would have to close the saloon and travel in winter weather to defend herself against a man who was already behind bars. The unfairness of it burned, but she'd learned long ago that fairness was a luxury the powerless rarely enjoyed. December brought snow that transformed Redemption Gulch into something almost beautiful, white drifts softening hard edges, ice coating trees in crystal, the whole world quiet and clean. Maylin prepared for the trial by going over Morrison's questions until she could answer them in her sleep, by reviewing every detail of that afternoon when Boone Cutter had walked into her saloon, and she prepared by accepting finally and completely that she couldn't control what a jury might decide. She could only tell the truth and hope it mattered. The night before she was due to leave for Helena, Ethan appeared at her door after closing time with a proposal that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. "Marry me," he said without preamble, standing in her doorway with snow dusting his shoulders. "Not because of the lawsuit or the trial or because you need protection. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and we're building something together that's stronger than fear." Maylin's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. "Ethan, I know the timing's terrible," he continued, the words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing them. "I know you're about to face the hardest fight of your life, and probably don't need this complication, but I also know that waiting for the perfect moment means waiting forever, and I'm tired of waiting. I want to marry you. I want to build our ranch together, and raise cattle and maybe children if you want them. I want to sit on our porch when we're old, and remember the day you drugged 4 outlaws because you were smarter than all of them combined." "You don't have to do this," Maylin said, though every part of her was screaming yes. "You don't have to tie yourself to me before the trial. If it goes badly, if the jury decides wrong, then we fight it together as husband and wife instead of as business partners who are courting," Ethan said firmly. "Maylin, I've lost one person I loved to circumstances I couldn't control. I'm not losing you to fear of what might happen. Marry me. Tomorrow, next month, after the trial. I don't care when. Just say you'll marry me eventually." Maylin looked at this good man who'd helped her when no one else would, who'd offered partnership before romance and patience before pressure, who was standing in her doorway proposing marriage on the worst possible day because he was brave enough to choose love when choosing fear would have been easier. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you. After the trial, after this is settled, when we can start our marriage without this shadow hanging over us, yes." Ethan's smile could have lit the whole dark street. He stepped forward and kissed her, gentle and fierce and full of promise, and Maylin let herself believe that maybe futures were built on exactly this kind of hope. The trial in Helena lasted 3 days. Maylin sat in the courtroom dressed in her green silk, flanked by Morrison and Ethan, and told her story to 12 men who would decide her fate. She described Boone Cutter's threats, his hand on her wrist, the moment she'd chosen chemistry over violence. She answered the opposing lawyers' hostile questions with calm clarity, refusing to be rattled by implications that she was dangerous or foreign or somehow at fault for being attacked. Morrison was brilliant, presenting Bridger's documentation with devastating precision and calling witnesses who testified to Cutter's violence and her good character. Mary Catherine took the stand and described the attempted arson. Sheriff McCready admitted he'd failed to protect her and praised her resourcefulness. Even Tom Fletcher testified, explaining how Mei Lin had become a respected business owner who paid her debts and treated people fairly. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman was a weathered rancher in his 60s who looked like he'd lived through every hardship Montana could devise. "We find in favor of the defendant, Mrs. Mei Lin Zhao," he announced, "and we award her damages in the amount of $1,000 for harassment, defamation, and legal costs." The courtroom erupted. Cutter's lawyer objected loudly. Morrison smiled his thin smile of victory, and Mei Lin sat very still, trying to process that she'd won. Not just the case, but validation that her choices had been right, that defending herself had been justified, that she mattered enough for justice to notice. Ethan's hand found hers under the table and squeezed tight. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Redemption Gulch, with half the town in attendance. Mei Lin wore her green silk and carried wildflowers Mary Catherine had somehow convinced to bloom indoors. Ethan wore his suit and looked at her like she was everything he'd ever hoped to find. The minister spoke about partnership and perseverance and the strange grace of second chances. When Ethan kissed her, his wife now, legally and truly, Mei Lin felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was bound. This was what safety felt like. This was what belonging meant. Not being tolerated or accepted, but chosen, wanted, loved for exactly who she was. The reception was held at the Golden Phoenix, which seemed fitting. The saloon where she'd fought for survival had become the place where she celebrated having found something beyond it. People drank her whiskey and ate food the town women had prepared together and danced to music that made the floorboards shake. And through it all, Mei Lin moved in a kind of daze, accepting congratulations from people who'd once crossed the street to avoid her, dancing with her husband while the community that had finally claimed her looked on with approval. Late in the evening, when most guests had departed and only close friends remained, Silas raised his glass in a toast. "To the bravest woman in Montana," he said, his old voice carrying clearly, "who taught us that strength isn't about size or weapons, but about refusing to break when breaking would be easier. To Mei Lin Cole." "To Mei Lin Cole," the room echoed, and she heard her new name spoken with respect and affection and genuine warmth. Ethan drove them to the ranch that night, through darkness lit by stars so numerous they looked like snow suspended in the sky. The house that had been his alone was now theirs together, a home built on partnership and watered with hope. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked as they stood on the porch, looking out at land that stretched toward mountains made silver by moonlight. Mei Lin considered the question seriously. Happy felt too simple a word for the complicated joy of having survived trauma and found love on the other side. Happy didn't capture the pride of having built a business from nothing, or the satisfaction of having earned respect from people determined not to give it, or the strange, sweet relief of having finally found a place where her foreignness wasn't a barrier to belonging. But it was close enough. "Yes," she said, "I'm happy." The years that followed proved her right to choose hope over fear. The ranch prospered with their combined management. Ethan's knowledge of cattle and crops merged with Mei Lin's head for numbers and negotiation. They expanded operations, hired workers, became the kind of operation other ranchers studied and envied. The Golden Phoenix continued under Silas's management, with Mei Lin maintaining ownership but leaving daily operations to someone who understood saloon culture better than she ever had. It remained profitable and respectable, a testament to what she'd built and proof that her legacy extended beyond one dramatic week. Redemption Gulch grew slowly, as frontier towns did. More families arrived, more businesses opened, and gradually the rough edges smoothed into something approaching civilization. Mei Lin became a fixture. Not the Chinese widow who ran a saloon, but Mrs. Cole, the rancher's wife who'd once defended herself against outlaws with chemistry and courage. Her story became town legend, grew embellished with each telling, until eventually the truth was almost as remarkable as the fiction. She bore Ethan 2 children, a daughter with his gray eyes and her determination, and a son with her dark hair and his patient temperament. She raised them to be brave and kind, to defend the defenseless and question injustice, to understand that their mother's foreignness was strength rather than weakness. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, she would sit on the porch with Ethan and watch the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of silk dresses and fresh beginnings. The green bottle, empty now and thoroughly cleaned, sat on a shelf in their home, not hidden but not prominently displayed. A reminder of the night everything changed, when a widow in a red silk dress had refused to break, and in that refusal had discovered her own strength. Sometimes Maylin would take it down and hold it, feeling the cool glass and remembering Boone Cutter's hand on her wrist, remembering the chemical fog that saved her saloon, remembering Marshall Bridger's quiet respect and Catherine's fierce solidarity, and the moment Ethan had proposed marriage in a doorway during a snowstorm, remembering that she'd arrived in Redemption Gulch with nothing. No family, no support, no reason to believe she'd survive more than a season, and she'd built a life anyway. Not just survival, but something richer and stranger and more beautiful than she'd dared imagine. She'd faced violence with strategy and fear with resolve. She'd earned respect from people who'd been determined to withhold it. She'd found love when love seemed impossible and built community where community had been denied. The empty bottle stayed on the shelf, a reminder that sometimes the smart move beats the strong move, that courage looks different than people expect, and that the stranger in the red silk dress had become exactly who she was meant to be. Not a victim, not a foreigner, not someone to pity or fear or ignore, just Maylin Cole, survivor and partner and beloved wife. Standing firm on Montana soil she'd claimed as her own, surrounded by the life she'd built with brave hands and a braver heart. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, witnesses to her transformation. The ranch spread wide and prosperous in the valley below. And in the house where she'd finally found home, Ethan's hand found hers in the familiar darkness, their fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing day after day, year after year. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft with the intimacy of shared nights and shared lives. "About how far I've come," Maylin said. "About the girl who arrived here with nothing and the woman who has everything that matters." "Everything?" Ethan teased gently. "Everything," Maylin confirmed, and meant it with her whole healed heart, because she'd learned the truth that courage whispered and fear tried to hide, that belonging wasn't something given by others, but something you claimed for yourself, that home wasn't a place you found, but a life you built, and that the strongest thing you could be was exactly and unapologetically yourself. The empty bottle caught moonlight through the window, glowing soft green in the darkness, a small vessel that had once held the power to save her life, now holding only memory and proof that she'd been brave enough to survive and wise enough to transform survival into something worth celebrating. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled. Inside, Maylin sat safe with the man she loved, in the home they'd built, surrounded by the future they were still creating together. And the widow of Redemption Gulch, who'd been lonely and afraid and determined not to break, smiled in the darkness and let herself be happy.